Hey guys, Stoic Squeeze podcast here. This is your host again, Lewis, along with my co-host Dimitri. What's up, D? How you doing?
Welcome. I'm outside the mountains of the ancient city of Sparta right now. So
there you go. Yeah, you have to take us on a tour one of these days.
So I guess I'm the second international guest.
True. So, well, Tallahassee's kind of international too. It's on the edge, right, Mike? But we got Mike Ormsbee today on the show, and really excited to have you on. Thank you for coming. He's the graduate program director for the Institute of Sports and Medicine at FSU. Did I get that right? Close enough? Okay. I told you I might botch that, but he has a ton of accolades. We're going to talk about nutrition, exercise, get into health and philosophy, and got so many questions for you, Mike. But Mike is a researcher, a scientist. He's an ex-athlete and currently does some pretty awesome research, more recently on things like diabetes and such. So welcome to the show, man. Thanks for coming.
Appreciate it. Yeah, these are always fun. We'll have to see where we can get to with our conversations. The hour is going to fly.
It always does. It always does. So we'd love to get to know you a little bit and how you came to where you are today and what got you into research, and then get into some of the nitty gritty on the latest research and see if we can give some information to our folks. So where does the story start for you?
So with a couple of Wisconsin guys, maybe you'll appreciate this. I grew up playing ice hockey.
Oh, there you go.
And so I grew up outside of Philadelphia playing ice hockey, went to college in upstate New York, played hockey through college, and then got into coaching. I actually moved out to South Dakota State University for my master's degree. And I was out there for 2 years, and at the same time, coaching the Brookings Rangers. They were a little youth team there, and we were the Pee Wee B state champs.
Nice.
Yeah, they were awesome. Back in what year was that? That must have been 2004, 2005.
Wow.
So go Rangers. So I was, studying exercise, science, and nutrition all through these different degrees. And I worked for a guy at South Dakota State named Matt Vukovich, and Matt was former science director for a company called EAS. EAS, you might remember, Experimental and Applied Sciences, started by a guy named Bill Phillips. Yep. Made some great products for a while, and they ended up selling their business to Abbott, and the product changed dramatically over time. And so Matt Vukovich left industry and went back to academics, and so I wanted to work in performance nutrition and supplements, and ended up landing a role in his lab out there. And then after that time, I decided to do some more mechanistic work and moved out to North Carolina. Went to East Carolina University and worked in their health and human performance group. And a lot of it was out of the Brody School of Medicine, which is at ECU. And ECU is really well known for their physiology specifically, and exercise physiology. So spent some time there and just kind of rode this exercise science and nutrition train the whole way. When I was coming through, there weren't a lot of places that merged nutrition with exercise. So I always made a conscious effort to take classes that they kind of dealt in both of these areas because I wanted to merge the two. And I knew that they would come together at some point. And now there are a lot of programs that merge these together. My Ph.D. was in a specific area called Bioenergetics. And bioenergetics was a combination of the things I wanted, which was exercise science, physiology, and a lot of nutrition in there. So technically it's like how we eat, what we eat, and how we make energy from that fuel is a bioenergetics definition. So we just rode that. I was real interested in that area, and we like to design applied studies. Like I was always under the impression that if you can't translate what you're doing to another human being, what's the value? It's really hard for me to wrap my mind around doing all this work and then nobody cares. So we try to design studies that are useful, that have an application to it, and forever. I can write a paper and 3 people might read it. But if that gets picked up by a media source and it's done correctly, which is a big caveat, then we get the message out to many more people than just the scientific literature. And so, yeah, we've had a lot of success with that. I came to FSU in 2010, so starting into my 12th year now down here. So rose up the ranks here from assistant to associate to a full professor, and just this year. And then I've been running the Institute of Sports Sciences and Medicine since 2014 in terms of having my own lab in here and my team and getting to design and do what we want to do out of this facility, which is pretty cool.
That is awesome. Yeah, and I see you got a lot of equipment heading over there, or you guys are doing some renovation work there.
Yeah, so we're fairly active with social media to try to show what we do here and talk about the great students that I have and the career trajectory that they're on is really the platform. But through those sites, which are basically just my name at Mike Ormsbee or at our lab at FSU ISSM, we show a lot of things. And we had a squat rack in here for 12 years. And it was just old and outdated. It still worked. We did a lot of good work with that rack. But we just moved to this new system to provide a little more floor space. So it's basically like a garage system. It's called PRX. And it folds up against the wall.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's super heavy duty. And then it's on like shocks. So you basically pull it down. It's pretty easy to pull down. And then it's easy to tuck stuff out of the way and provide a little more clean looking floor plan in the lab. So yeah, we just put that in last week and it looks great.
That's awesome.
So is Squattober an actual thing, or is it just a plan?
Squattober, yeah. I think I saw that on maybe Sorinex will put that out calling it Squattober. I'm like, oh, that's great. So I said Squattober's almost here. We better get our new rack in.
So you said something interesting. You wanted to merge the two between the sports science and the nutrition. How come, this seems like nowadays from all the stuff that I've learned in the last few years, it's just common sense that the two would go together. But how come, like traditionally or back in the day, they didn't see the use of stringing the two together, and how did that evolve? When did people start taking it more seriously and start doing the research on that?
Well, historically, exercise science was built out of PE, so physical education programs, which are typically in a college of education. Nutrition historically would be more of a STEM field and, in its own area, or biological sciences are involved in some of the more traditionally heavy-duty sciences. And so exercise science has evolved so much, and that there's still PE areas of interest and colleges and departments at many different universities that are strictly with physical education, which is a great area. But the exercise science piece of that has sort of morphed out of PE, where we still obviously are worried about physical activity, but we look more at the science and mechanisms behind it. So as exercise science became recognized as its own science, and its own, that it was, for a while we'd get like all the athletes who couldn't really make it in class thought they could take exercise science and, oh good, I'm doing exercise. But they get, oftentimes if they're not a great student, you can get them in there and like, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Because it gets real complicated really fast. So anyway, that's how the science of exercise got to be independent. And then nutrition was like its own area, and many schools still have a different nutrition department. FSU started it early. Before I came here, one of the former chairs of the department here at FSU, Dr. Bob Moffitt, saw the need to combine these things. And so I don't know how true it is, but the claim to fame was that FSU had the first nutrition and exercise science department that was merged together. And I'll take their word for it.
I believe them.
Like
yeah.
Do these departments, is it also because FSU is famous for athletics and stuff, trying to get in?
No,
okay,
not at
so
all. Nope.
Gotcha.
Yeah, not at all. And that's what's interesting too, is a whole other conversation, is how athletics merges into these areas at different universities.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So athletics, you would think, would be more melded in with athletics, particularly in something like sports science and exercise science and nutrition. We do a pretty good job at it, but it's all about the personnel that are in place at that time. just like anywhere, you can get into these silos where people are defensive of their position. You know, in athletics and academics could have different interests. So a lot of times the barrier to working together with athletics in particular is that a coach needs an answer now or tomorrow. Or, you know, we could run a few things, but if it's an academic study, my biggest priority is publishing that work. So I would say, oh, come on in, but I'm going to write a paper on it. It's going to take me a year and a half. Like, no, right. That's a different team. I need an answer tomorrow. So that is why it hasn't really worked so well. Some schools are doing really well with it, again, if the personnel's right. And some athletics departments have hired people like me who the job details are different. Their job is to get information to the coaches and the team, and not necessarily just to publish papers. And so in that model, which is sustainable to get data back quickly, athletics is using sports science, but not necessarily working with the academic portion of it seamlessly. Yeah,
at a university, there are so many facets and siloed departments doing their own thing. And I do see, you know, my experience selling into universities that, you know, the research department could be something totally different than this other department. There's opportunity to work together, but they're just siloed, you know, for whatever reason, and, you know, have their own priorities, like you said. Yeah.
I tell you what, one of the best, so here we have just great, right now, there's a great personnel in place. So the strength coach here, Elisa Angelis for Olympic sports, is phenomenal. And, you know, right when she came in, she reached out. I'm like, hey, let's talk. What can we do to help each other? And then some of the associate ADs all the way through the AD have been wonderfully supportive. And so, you know, I've had the opportunity to speak to all the coaches and big coach meetings. And
that's awesome.
I just tried to make this step to be just completely transparent. So I didn't go in saying, hey, I can do this, this, and this for you. I said, we have some equipment you might like. I don't know if I can help you at all, but if you're interested in talking, let's have a conversation. And so in that way, we've had really good relationships with much of the staff that decided to reach out or to take a look at us. COVID threw a wrench in all that, obviously, with the ability to communicate quickly and to actually have human beings in the lab and all of that. But by and large, we're separate entities, but we do, and we can talk about this, we have a couple of studies ongoing with athletics right now, which are really exciting.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's so many directions I want to take this chat with you. One of them, if you don't mind, if we segue, is in your spare time, you did write this book a few years ago, which is called Changing Body Composition Through Diet and Exercise. So not only are you a professor, you decided to write this book, and you narrated yourself, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. So some of your audience might be familiar with the great courses. You could basically, it was for an audience that just wanted to continue learning.
Sure.
And so they're real academic in nature for the most part. And these courses, it's like the largest distributor of online course content. And so they had a recruiter that called me years ago, and I went up to Washington, D.C. and did an audition for one episode of this show, because it's video is what the traditional format is. And so once I got the part, I scripted out 24 30-minute lectures. And then once we had the script done, then I had to go up to the studio and just outside of DC and film everything. And so we filmed 24 lectures over the course of almost 2 weeks. It was like a week and a half, multiple a day, retakes, redos, you know, throat lozenges because we're talking all day long. And that was a cool experience, just totally different because I've never read off a teleprompter. So I was like, you know, trying to read my own stuff off a teleprompter, but also sound like I'm just coming up with it on the fly. So it's a different type of an experience. And they built a studio lab. So it kind of looks a little bit like a lab behind me and some of the things we might have in our exercise and human performance lab here. That was a great process. I took material that I was familiar with. I tried to make it digestible for every person that would listen to it. And then again, end every single lecture, and again, there are 24 of them, with some type of a small take-home key point. I'm a strong believer in baby steps in this process. I've seen so many times where a person who is giving advice to somebody about weight loss or body comp manipulation or strength training just give too much at one time, and it's overload. It leads to burnout really quickly. I've never seen success with that approach. So we just dialed it way back. The other thing we did with that is we tried to not sell anything. The angriest emails I get about it are like, what program should I do? Or why don't you give me a diet plan? Or what's the exercise prescription? I'm like, that's not why I did it. I did it just to give information so that the viewer could take it, understand where I'm going with it, and then have choices about, we do a lot of personal preference. There's one part in there where I'm like, should I eat breakfast? I'm like, do you like breakfast? Because if you like breakfast, then you should eat breakfast. Let's work around what you like and what you don't like so that it's sustainable. Because that's the biggest problem we see is like unsustainable, I guess, daily life activities. And you change it all at once, it lasts for 3 days and you're done.
Yeah, I thought it was a phenomenal book. I'm glad they recruited you to put that together, and glad that you can put voiceover work on your resume now as well. I was going to ask you where your website is, where I could buy some tart cherry juice, but I guess you're not selling any. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
So Lewis, I sometimes get a little wrapped up in the woo, and I'm not as educated as Lewis is on these subjects and stuff. And, it's hard to disseminate what's what. And my mother and actually grandmother have been talking about tart cherry juice for years, and supposedly helping like sleep benefits and stuff. And I tried it, but I was actually surprised. So what's the particular thing about tart cherry juice that's beneficial?
Now it's used mostly as an anti-inflammatory. So having a solid dose of tart cherry juice, a lot of folks will use just to reduce inflammation. And there's evidence that works. The bigger question for most people, like for your grandma and whoever, getting general body inflammation down for the long haul is a good thing. But then the question is, why is it up? What's happening? Is it just aging? Is it the food they're eating? Is there there's something going on behind the scenes. For an athlete, that's really used strategically. So if you have to compete multiple days in a row, then a lot of places would use something like tart cherry juice to just try to control some inflammation without using medication. But if you're just a regular gym goer and you're taking products or even tart cherry juice to reduce inflammation, you could substantially decrease your ability to gain muscle or have gains over that time. Yeah.
And by the way, to our listeners, the book wasn't about just tart cherry juice. There are so many great chapters in there. That was just one of the nuggets in there. And you talked about so many things, from metabolism to energy production, insulin, metabolic flexibility. There's so many things in there that I will, to your point, you made it so digestible that I do feel that someone that's never heard of or picked up a book about nutrition could pick up this book and have some takeaways and do something with it, especially with your takeaways after each chapter. And if you don't mind, there a couple of topics stood out to me, some things that you said that I wanted to bring up. One of them was you essentially, in some of your chapters, said you are what you eat, which is something that we've all heard before. But you went into some detail that even impacted me like I've never been impacted, in terms of you are what you eat, in terms of what food is made of, and then what your cells are made of, and how that works together, and what your body actually does with all of the food that you put into your body over a course of time, from energy production to how I think you worded it as, firing in the right way. I found that so interesting. And, like I said, I felt impact. I've heard the term, like I said, you are what you eat. But after hearing you say it and the way you said it and explained it, I definitely increased my vegetable intake. Not that it was bad, but I was like, I think I need to eat more vegetables now after listening to this. But do you mind going over that a little bit, and specifically maybe some things about ATP and, what your cells do with food?
Yeah. So yeah, that's like a 3-week
I know.
lecture in my
Yeah.
drive.
Yeah. 30 seconds, if you don't mind.
Let's slow it down. So the basics I think, are this. Most people interpret, if you're not into this field, you'd say, okay, you are what you eat. What the heck does that mean? That's so sort of out there. Maybe people think about it as I eat a food, they know they digest it in their stomach, and then probably some of that gets into them to provide energy, but then the rest is like excretion, right? That's how people think about food. When you look at the cellular level and you break apart a food that you eat, it becomes chemicals, right? Carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens, if it's protein. And when you eat those foods, their components actually make up different structures in our body. And I think that's what's the cool part. Like an easy example would be like calcium, right? So we know our bones have a lot of calcium. Well, we eat calcium. So there's an example where you can see, okay, I'm eating this and maybe that ends up in my bones. Other examples are like lipids, fats, fish oils, for example. Well, after consumption of that stuff, some of that will end up, every cell has a lipid layer around the outside of it, a double lipid layer. And part of that integrates into that lipid bilayer from the food you eat. So for me, it's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe how much that impacts me too. It's like everything, this is going to end up somewhere on me. Where do I want that to be? How is that going to provide energy? Now, that's just structurals, right? Protein, for example, is a good one. If you eat protein, that protein will get into your system and you start to put it into what's called an amino acid pool. And then wherever the need is in your body, lots of times we talk about it in terms of muscle. The muscle will pull from that amino acid pool and actually construct muscle. Our muscle fibers are made of protein. So, the most easy sense, you eat protein, it can end up in your muscle. In fact, your whole muscle turnover, like there's a colleague of mine named Luc van Loon from the Netherlands, and he often will give lectures where he says, your entire muscle will be degraded and built back up in a very short amount of time. It's a whole new muscle and not that long after you've started to eat foods, right? So you're talking just a couple week period and you could have complete turnover of muscle tissue. That's important, and that's really interesting to me in terms of structures and what we're eating. Energy is a little different. So in my world, energy is ATP, so adenosine triphosphate. What does that mean to your viewer? That's what we call the energy currency of the body. You can't do anything without ATP. If you don't have ATP, you're dead. You need to be able to provide it. And the way you make it is from foods, and specifically carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So most people know what carbohydrates are, and that is what we would consume, and then that turns into glucose in our blood, and then we have to get that blood into that glucose from the blood into our skeletal muscle cells, and that's where these transporters and all this stuff happens to get the glucose into the cell. But once it's there, it goes through a process called glycolysis, and that is just breaking the glucose down to provide ATP. It doesn't provide that much. So like carbohydrates might provide, I don't know, you might get 32 to 36 ATP if you completely break down one molecule of glucose. All right, so that's pretty abstract, right? And it doesn't really matter in this conversation, but compare that to fats. One 18 carbon fatty acid will provide you something like 129 or more ATP. So it's like 32 versus 130. So you can see right out of the gate that fats will provide a ton more total ATP energy for the body. And so that's really cool. It just means that if you have fat, you have more energy that you can produce from it. And if we don't even eat, if you just look at even a lean person, we had plenty of stored body fat to use as a fuel to go a long distance. Of course, that's not.
I've heard someone who's at 10% body fat has about 100,000 calories stored. Is that about right, or?
It would depend, but it could be up to that high. I would say 25,000 to 100,000 probably. But that's assuming you would use just that fuel source, and that's not how it really works. But there's so much body fat stored even in a 10% person, which is really low. So that's cool. But then I think it comes down to the exercise bit. So all three of us look like we're sitting, right? So we're just hanging out. It's easy to use fat in a condition when you're sedentary, or if you're working out at an intensity that's pretty moderate to low. So if you're walking, jogging, even lifting weights at a low intensity, something under about maybe 65% of your maximum, so 65 and under, fat's a dominant fuel source for us. The tricky part comes when you need to go hard. So in most people, if you're going over 65 or 70% of your maximum, so or higher intensity efforts, you rely on carbohydrates. And that has to do with a number of things, but probably the biggest one is the availability of oxygen. So, at high intensities, you kind of are out of breath, right? And in that circumstance, oxygen is somewhat limited because you're just gasping for breath. And you're running out of the ability to use carbohydrates to produce ATP. And it forces you to slow down, get your breath back. And when you're slowing down and getting your breath back, you're switching back to more of a fat use as a fuel. So that ability to switch between carbohydrates at the high intensity and fats at the low intensity is called metabolic flexibility. We want to be really flexible so that you can respond to any scenario that might arise. You're taking a walk, you want to be using fat as a fuel because you can, but a dog jumps out and it's chasing you, got to start running. You want to be able to switch to carbohydrate so you can run and get away from that dog. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it, from what you're eating down to making ATP.
So Lewis, from what I understood, keto's for sure the way to go.
Yeah,
More
he just
ATP
said that fat has more energy.
I know,
So I think all the keto people just said exactly.
Yeah, so from a perspective of any dietary choice, there's even data on this, if it's keto or zone or DASH or even high carb diets, it doesn't matter after a year. It's what one you can adhere to. So they all do a pretty good job because they limit calorie intake, and there are obviously some nuances to all this, but in general, they're all going to do just about the same job over the course of a year. Some might work a little more acutely, like in the first couple of weeks, but if you give it time, after a year, they're all the same. So it's whatever one you can adhere to. It's a big point. It's like we don't have to be in these camps of all or none, keto or not. For most individuals who are exercising, a lot of times they don't get to an exercise intensity that's high enough to really care about this. Just eat how you want to eat. If keto is how you want to eat, great. If it's not, that's okay. There are many ways to eat and still lose weight if that's the goal for individuals. But for an elite athlete, the data clearly demonstrate that carbohydrates are used at the high end of exercise and should be used accordingly.
Yeah. So basically, too, the quality of foods that you're eating are going to affect your cells in a cellular level. Like, it's going to make a difference between if you're eating a junk food diet and, healthy, high nutrient dense foods. Is that kind of the takeaway from that as well?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of harder to show some of that with research. I think logically that makes sense. We sometimes say, like, if you're going to get 100 calories from broccoli versus Doritos, like, clearly one has more micronutrients and a better nutrient composition. And it makes sense logically that would be more helpful. There's actually not a lot of data to support it, but I think it's just because those are harder to design and various things happen with that. However, one recent one by Kevin Hall came out where it's talking about ultra processed foods, and his data clearly showed that ultra processed foods, which would be like the Dorito example, not only are they highly palatable and create an environment where you want to eat more of them, but they did have the worst sort of regulation of the things they were looking at: metabolism, body composition, etc. So yeah, I think that there are nuances, like calorie for calorie. If you have high carbs or low carbs, or high fat or low fat, it's all about a calorie reduction. But if you talk about the quality of your cells and the foods you're eating and the ability to stop eating, or the satiation of those foods, the ultra processed sort of junk foods are certainly the ones that make you want to eat more of them. And sometimes foods get lumped in the wrong categories. So someone might say, stop eating donuts if you're, on keto because it's too much carbohydrates. But if you look at a donut, there's quite a lot of fat in there too. So it's not just carbohydrates. You're talking about eliminating foods that are high in calories. And so there are certainly a lot of details to all of it, but my general recommendation is don't be so nervous about all this. Just reduce something. If you don't want to eat breakfast and go intermittent fasting, for example, fine. It's another way to control total calorie intake. We used to call intermittent fasting just skipping breakfast, right? And now it's intermittent fasting. But yeah, it's clearly
millennials
one strategy.
Now it's cool. Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff out there about intermittent fasting specifically, and besides the calorie reduction and personal preference, is a lot of the major benefits like the autophagy that it builds and such overstated? Because this is something that Lewis and I discuss often, and I'm starting to realize there's not a lot to support that there's any extra benefits.
Yeah, I think the consensus would be that autophagy is way overstated from some of those fasting type scenarios. Does it exist? Yeah. Is it something that it's just like a word that too many people throw around now, and it's not actually, I would say the data in my mind aren't supporting the fact that autophagy is a leading mechanism with that gap in eating, that break in eating. Is it possible that there's more to it? Yeah, I haven't seen enough literature on that to say that's the primary reason that it's working or whatever it's doing. There's some thought that if you eat fewer calories, you live longer. A lot of that's from animal data, where they really regulate calories, and these low calorie intakes in animals, they tend to live longer, and they're smaller species and things. In the human trials, it doesn't always work that way, and there's even anecdotal documentaries where people were trying to eat these super low calories. They just end up being miserable for a long period of time, as opposed to just eating normally and being happy with it.
Yeah, it's made to sound like autophagy is something that you can actually switch on or off by doing specific things, where it's just something that your body kind of does. And technically there are a lot of ways that your body maybe, does the act of autophagy, like exercise and lifting and things like that, where maybe you don't need to make it all complicated by eating at specific times or doing something specific to just somehow all of a sudden you're turning it on somehow. I don't think it works like that.
Yeah. And I would say that I agree with that. Yeah. There's something to it, but there's just not evidence in humans right now that I'm like, yeah, that's certainly what's happening. And I think that's why we should be doing intermittent fasting. However, I will say that intermittent fasting tends to work in the literature. If you like to eat that way, it is one strategy that should work. Because of
it limiting calories as a method to limit calories. So okay. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, originally people thought that if you limited that morning feeding, that you'd be so hungry you would overeat later. And there's maybe one or two papers where that was shown, but most of the newer data aren't indicating that you eat more later just because you fasted in the morning.
Sure. So a lot of it, like you're saying, it comes down to personal preference and what you can do over the long term.
Right, exactly. That long-term piece is so important. Dimitri, you were talking about it this morning about sustaining weight loss, and that's the whole key. Sometimes people say it's easy to lose weight. It's hard to keep it off.
It was fun reading your book, listening to that Audible, and when I went through that massive weight loss, I did a strict keto diet for a year, but you brought up a lot of points and things of concern. What I ate was basically a lot of vegetables and then meat, and then the only fat sources that I got were basically olive oil, avocado oil, and now I'm starting to see some red flags with coconut oil, which I didn't use too much of, but it was a very clean diet. I ate a lot of nutrient-dense foods, and once again, my adherence to it was phenomenal, which is what made me successful, and I really enjoyed eating that way. After reading your book, and I still definitely have a long way to go, I think I'm going to do things differently, because one of the things that I didn't do well is I don't think I had enough protein in my diet, which from what I understand, like the negative aspects of that is you're going to lose lean muscle mass, which it's not about like the weight. It's about getting rid of the fat, maintaining that lean muscle mass, and changing the body composition. And I exercised a lot more than I was before. I got 10,000 steps a day. Got up to doing like 100 push-ups a day when I first started, did like 6, and just did body squats and planks, and that was pretty well for me. But afterwards, 2019, I kind of slipped, got back to like 280 pounds. Since then, I've recovered and lost 40 of that back, but I definitely see some of the not so good results of that, like not as much muscle mass and such. And I think your book and the lecture was just amazing to solidify to me that there's much better ways to do this, and especially for a lot of people with fat loss, you know, that's definitely I'm a cautionary tale, and like you can do it like more intelligently, and you know, keep that body composition and lean muscle mass there, and just do it better ultimately.
Yeah, some great points in there, Dimitri. And I have a couple of examples to share with you that you reminded me of. So when people lose massive amounts of weight, the biggest issues that tend to come up is, one, putting it back on, which we call weight recidivism. And when we add that weight back on, it's actually easier because you've lost a ton of weight, but a lot of the contribution that's from muscle. And so with the muscle gone, some people theorize that that's why it's easier to put more weight on, and not just weight, but fat weight, as you continue to eat how you used to. And we have a strong biological drive to maintain a certain weight once we're used to it for a while. So you tend to work against that in most cases. So someone who's traditionally lean and just kind of always lean, that's where you stay. And someone who's bigger, it's much harder to stay down on weight, and that's for quite a long period of time, right? So I feel like I need to mention this. We did a study. Eddie Joe was a doctoral student at the time. Now he's a professor out in California. And he was working with a colleague of mine here, Dr. Jay Kim, and I was involved with this study as well. And they took people who were going for bariatric surgery. So these were individuals who were very overweight, and they wanted to do some surgery to fix the problem. And so they show up to the bariatric center to start getting some information, and then instead they see our team there, and Eddie saying, hey, instead of getting the surgery, will you join our research study for a little while? And so what ended up happening was that these people who are on a medically prescribed low-calorie diet, and this is just what's standard across bariatric centers, it's like 800 calories a day. It's very low. Super low. No one would really prescribe anything that low. And not only that, it's typically mostly liquid type diets. Well, that's not very satiating. We know that the need to chew and sort of how that crunch is something that we like. And so we said, listen, we think resistance training and protein are going to help. And let's try 12 weeks with us before you get this surgery and see what happens. And so we took 2 groups, and they're all on this low 800 calorie diet. We gave both groups more protein because it was so drastically low from what they should be. And that bumped them up to about 1,100 calories of food, including the extra protein. And then one group had the protein and resistance training. All right, and when we did that for 12 weeks, the group who resistance trained only lost like 4% of their muscle mass despite losing a massive amount of weight. The other group, who had the diet restriction and even the added protein, but did not resistance train with us, but did the standard care, which was some calisthenics and some recommendations to walk, they ended up losing nearly 25% of their muscle mass in that same 12-week period. And to me, that was like, holy cow, why are we not including both protein and resistance training in the regimens for people who are severely overweight?
That is
Yeah.
amazing. Wow.
That's
an incredible conclusion to that
and
study.
everything went
Yeah.
hand in hand with it. Like
Yeah.
you'd expect your resistance training, so your strengths got better. Like obviously, And you said the thing about push-ups, like 100 push-ups a day. I mean, that's phenomenal.
Well,
And you
or
guys are
probably like 70% to like military push-ups if you like broke it down, but it was pretty.
Right. So have you guys heard of this new push-up study?
I read about it on your Instagram the other day.
Yeah. So it came out a couple years ago, but someone tweeted it in a nice format recently. And they were firefighters, and they're all young male firefighters. I think they were only up to age 32. And the minimum amount of push-ups that you needed to do to have a reduction in cardiovascular risk was only 10 push-ups straight. That's
great.
Really low. That's lower than I would have thought, right? Just 10 push-ups. So that shows that even amongst firefighters, there are a lot of individuals and who you think would be trained.
Yeah. I asked Lewis, I'm like, what firefighters can't do 10 push-ups and help us, please? Like,
I'll tell you, in old work that we had done with firefighters, there are certain companies where it is a problem. And it's different state by state. My wife was running some research, major firefighter research for FEMA for a while. And this is when we lived in New England. And some of the individuals were 300-400 pounds, were their fitness directors. And that was astonishing to us to see. And then when they were getting different firefighter groups, one of them was out of California, and all those guys were like, the calendar guys. They are super fit. And so I think it's region by region. It's what the standard or protocol is in each house, and it's completely different. But if we just take this to the population scale, at least for youngish men, you should be able to do 10 push-ups. And the real benefit came if you could do 40 consecutive
96% reduction I was reading. And
massive reduction. So, a lot of people now are like, all right, let's get to a 40 place where we can do 40 push-ups. And for a researcher, what's nice, and I think that post was talking about from the original person who posted that, was that's pretty inexpensive. That's something that everybody can do. From a lab perspective, you don't need fancy equipment. You can just do a push-up test pre and post some type of intervention and see what happens. The data work did not show anything for women because they didn't test women. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if anybody's working on that or not, but it seems like a great little study to pull off on women and see if it's what the numbers are for women to have that risk reduction.
So I know we got to wrap up here soon, and really quick, I just want to pivot, and that's okay, Lewis. What are you doing right now with diabetes? Because that's a subject that fascinates me, and I have a couple of questions about diabetes in general.
Sure. We've done a little bit with type 1 and with type 2. So with type 1, we had a really cool experience. There was an athlete competing in Ultraman, Florida. Ultraman is a race that's all over the place, but the Florida one is in and around Orlando, which is only like a 3-4 hour drive from where I live. And so this athlete just wanted some data collected on this, and we wanted to see how their blood sugar changed over the course of a very long race. It's a 3-day race, so you start on Friday with a 10K swim, and you do like a 70-mile bike, I think it is, right afterwards. You go to bed late, you sleep, you wake up Saturday morning, and you ride 170 miles on your bike, which takes a long time. If you're fast, you have more rest time. If you're not, you finish late, you go right to sleep, and you wake up Sunday, and you run a double marathon on the third day. That's hard for anybody. Not a lot of people do this. There's usually like 30 to 40 people who are qualified to actually do it. And this type 1 diabetic, who's a good friend of ours now, invited us to track him over time. So in that study, we wanted to see glucose regulation from somebody who was in a real life experiment with exercise. And the biggest take home for me from that was that his most regulated time for glucose control, where he felt the best, was while he was exercising. And that's why, as a college athlete, he was a long distance swimmer. I think that had a big role, because when he's exercising, he just felt the best. And that is because there's a mechanism to it. There's 2 ways to get glucose out of your blood and into your cells. One of them is with insulin. Well, that's a problem for type 1 diabetics. They don't make insulin. The other way is with muscle contractions. So if you are just contracting your muscle over and over, you can get glucose in your cell. So for a person who can't get glucose in their cell, they can actually exercise and do it to some extent. And so people like him just felt better while they're doing this long duration exercise. And that was really cool. People knew that, but we were excited to work with him and show that. And we wrote a case study up and published that back in maybe 2016 or so. So that was our type 1 experience. And we also put like glucose monitors, his continual glucose monitors on him for that ride. In type 2, that's our new grant. So we just got a grant from the National Institutes of Health. It's myself and Dr. Bob Hickner. And we teamed up to investigate how resistance training directly compares to aerobic training and how that influences fat metabolism as well as glucose regulation in obese postmenopausal women. And so it's a very specific group, and they have to be diabetic as well. So in that scenario, people have looked at aerobic versus resistance training for fat metabolism, breaking fat out of the cells and then using it for energy like we talked about earlier. But a lot of times the exercise itself is not calorie controlled. So aerobic exercise, you would think, would tend to just burn more total calories and tend to show benefits. More lately, resistance training is showing these benefits, and we think that it's going to be as effective or more than the aerobic side of this. If we can show it's as effective, it gives people multiple modes of exercise to choose from. And in some of them are obesity research, some of those individuals were just not inclined to want to go run. It hurts. Or sit on a bike. The bike seat's uncomfortable. There's different ways. But some of them are very strong, particularly in their legs. And so psychologically, it's really cool to push more weight and to feel good about it and to feel stronger than everybody else in there because you are strong in your legs. That's an interesting scenario. And if that's the case, you can see a scenario where physicians or exercise scientists or personal trainers could prescribe resistance training more readily for people with diabetes who are obese as a tool to combat this. The other thing we did is we decided to, with Dr. Hickner's help, he's bringing in some mechanisms that we weren't using. So some more biopsy work. We're doing glucose clamps to see how insulin and glucose are regulated differentially pre and post training in the different types of training. So we're kind of throwing all these different really cool high level techniques at it, and that's why we were successful with this grant. It's a 5-year grant. It starts this year, and we're just now hiring personnel and getting everybody trained up to start this study.
That's awesome. Yeah, keep us updated on that. It sounds really cool.
Yeah, we're excited about it. It's a big, big endeavor. Sometimes you write these grants, and then when you get them, like, holy cow, now we got to do a lot of stuff. So anyway, we're starting that process, and I think I forgot to mention that we're controlling calories.
Okay.
So each workout, the individual, whether they're in resistance or aerobic, has to burn 300 calories in that workout.
Awesome.
There you go.
Well, I know we're at the hour here, and there's so many more hours of questions that we have, and hopefully we get you back on. But what we touched on, I thought, was awesome and so important to get out to people. Your book is, thank you for writing that book. I think it's everyone should read it. Like I've said before the call, it should be a mandatory course on some level of our education system. And while it feels like there are a lot of things fighting against us in terms of health in this society, I feel like also there are people like you and information and accessibility and a lot of ways to be healthy too. And you don't have to take it to extremes, is a lot of your takeaways from your book and what you said today. But starting with something simple, starting with something small. There's so many strategies in your book that someone could literally start today by listening to it. So really appreciate that. And thanks for coming on, man. Really appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy. And I'll post, where people can follow you and your research and any other way we can get the word out for you. Let us know. All
right. Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, I feel like we just got through the intro, so we definitely have more to talk about at some other time. But yeah, happy to entertain questions from your audience if they just shoot me a note on social media or whatever, and we'll go from there.
For sure.
Thanks so much, Mike. We appreciate your time.
Okay. Bye-bye.